craft.
My craft is death.
What is your pledge?
My pledge is eternal service.
Well, Space Marine 2 has finally arrived after 13 long years, and I gotta say, I'm glad I played it, but I was expecting a little bit more. I guess it's true what they say, though. Warhammer never changes. That's how the saying goes, right?
War never changes.
Well, if not, then it should be.
If not, there should be.
Now, the original Space Marine never blew me away, but it was solid, backed by nice production values, had a serviceable plot, and boasted a simplistic but tight gameplay loop. Space Marine had a great foundation, it just lacked a spark of variety or set pieces that it needed to be something really special. So that's why I'm surprised how unambitious Space Marine 2 feels, despite having an arguably better story and production values, and having new features to the series and relatively fleshed out campaign co-op, PvP modes, and 8 dedicated co-op missions that interlace with the main story. And by all accounts, new developer Saber is passionate and excited about this project, both as a culmination of their own design goals and also as Warhammer fans. And Space Marine 2 does put together some pretty awesome power fantasy moments, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Space Marine 2 is an experience carried by production value, vibes, and, how long the finisher moves remain exciting to you.
The champion lies.
Its story is reasonably better, but it repeats almost every trope from the first game, as if it were taking notes from the Force Awakens approach. Its combat is so simplified and lacking counterplay that it seems overly balanced to encourage campaign co-op so you can out-attrition the enemy with sheer numbers alone. Space Marine 2's PvP and co-op modes feel like the center of developmental attention and yet are its most underwhelming aspect. Now, some fans might find all of this to be protesting too much, and they just want more of what they already liked. Same, but different.
Same, but different. But still same.
And you know what? That's okay. But for players who aren't just here to lap up anything Warhammer related based on license alone, and who want to see the series prosper, this sequel feels less like a committed innovation on its core gameplay loop and more like a pretty, often exciting, but fairly hollow remake of sorts, just there to gauge interest in the IP after years of dormancy. It's likable and sometimes invigorating, but just like the roar of battle, eventually you want the quiet of peace, or something to take home with you that's a little deeper than just butt-mashing your way through hordes over and over and over again. Space Marine 2 just became less and less memorable the more I played it. But let's get stuck in to how and why that may not matter to the Warhammer faithful, and whether its irksome habits are enough to dissuade you from enjoying its edgelord power fantasy goodness. Now, the first Space Marine was a fine-looking game for 2011, with decent effects and character models and a real sense of scale. Space Marine 2 admirably ups the ante across the board with some caveats. The high-camp voice acting is good fun, and while I greatly miss the cool, calm, and collected tone of Mark Strong as Titus, there's a certain snarl to Clive Standish's performance that feels right at home in this particular story.
Where is Luz?
Inside. They have the facility, Luz, and the power source.
Holy terror.
Perhaps you were right, Titus.
What's not theoretical?
I also adore any use of the Scottish accent in games, and this ginger adventure right here that we report to is always fun to listen to during mission briefings. The villains are mustache twirlingly over the top, and everyone's been on the juice a little too long, but it's all good, melodramatic fun. Unfortunately, facial models and facial animations are the least impressive part of this product and most obviously show this game's budgetary or technological restrictions. Titus didn't emote much in the first game, but here in Space Marine 2 it's almost like he can't. His compatriots also have pretty blank stares much of the time, and they rely on their solid vocal performances to stand out. There's also a fair amount of screen flickering and weird cutscene glitches throughout, and textures can be fuzzy for a while and take a bit to load in sometimes. The load times are also pretty long for a modern age video game, but small niggles aside, Space Marine 2 is a pretty epic looking game otherwise. The art design of Space Marine 2 is phenomenal. There's a richness of color contrast in the huge levels, and there's a ton of business going on in the backgrounds of shots that just grants a sense of scale and epicness to what's going on. Nima Fakara and Steve Mollitz's score sells the whole experience, though. It's pulse-pounding, epic orchestral stuff, and it just makes you feel like you're the baddest mofo in town. I was so impressed by how even the moments of downtime have this swell of drama to them, like they're just building up to the next explosive encounter. So the vibes are immaculate, as the kids would say, and that's really what carries the experience, because, oh my good lord, is the combat a downgrade in this game. The first game had smooth and impactful combat that encouraged the player to wade in deep to stun enemies, and then pull off a finisher move to regain health as needed, one which also left them open to counterattacks while performing these finishers. It was a simple, clean, and frantic opt-in bargain for the player to be used at their discretion, and it worked because it actually provided interesting and rewarding friction. In Space Marine 2, we get a health and shield system not unlike the first game, but one which only restores shields if we pull off finisher moves. Finisher opportunities crop up only after we've weakened the enemy to within an inch of death, and they just stand there like the demons in the past two Doom games waiting to be glory killed. The finisher kills are crunchy and full of girthy sound effects, but there's no longer any strategic component to them, as you're completely invincible while pulling them off. Honestly, as long as you're evading the occasional sniper shot or just big boss attacks, you can basically just swing your melee weapon over and over, and most hordes will eventually fall, as they really don't do any damage outside of the mid-grade enemies that directly attack you and require parrying. The swarms are a bit of a smoke and mirrors effect to make you think more is going on than it actually is. It's a weirdly undercooked system with very little about it that feels like a gameplay loop. It's just whack the thing or shoot the thing and then click to finish them off and move on. You'll get the occasional environmental puzzle or holdout sequence where you've got to stay in an area to make a meter tick up or something like that. But in the main campaign, you'll basically just be going room to room, clicking to open doors to the next area to run through, clear an area, do the same thing once or twice more, maybe go up an elevator, have a little conversation, and then repeat. It's got almost the exact same rhythm as the first game, and yet it knows fewer dance moves. This might not be so bad though if the basic weaponry just felt better. Guns are almost all machine gun variants, maybe one with a scope or an underslung grenade launcher, but all of them sound extremely compressed and unimposing, and none of them really stand out. The first game had a large variety of different gun types that I was always excited to adapt my playstyle to in order to take advantage of their unique strengths, like ripping orc heads off with the sniper variants from afar, or even charging into the fray with abandon so you can use the Vengeance grenade launcher, or melting hordes with my plasma gun. Not only is the iconic Vengeance launcher totally missing for the single-player campaign, the other returning guns like the Melta or plasma weapons show up only occasionally and seem severely nerfed. Outside of a flamethrower you use for maybe one level, you've got very little in the way of fun, memorable, or even effective weaponry. Enemies outside of grunts just take a ton of shots to kill, and because enemies are almost always coming at you in swarms, you're rarely able to just pick them off one by one with accuracy alone, so you're just spraying and praying. The melee doesn't fare much better. It's rather underwhelming both in effect and spectacle. The pause menu screen promises all these combos you'll be able to pull off, but I got maybe one to actually work, and it's not like you really need them anyway. You just need to attack, and then hold down for a heavy to kind of knock guys back and maybe finish one or two of them off with a charged shot that you get access to, but even this really only works on the little bitty enemies. The enemy AI is lacking too, ranging from rock stupid to relentlessly interrupting your animations, which already suffer from immense input lag. The grunts tend to just sit there and let you pummel them unless they're jumping at you from off screen or maybe lining up charged sniper shots. No, the little guys can be fun to engage as they're just kind of there for you to mow through, and it's fun to use the time parry to grab one of them as they leap at you from off screen and you just tear them in half. But all this tends to only feel fun if you're not completely crowded. If you ever get overrun by enemies at any point, you can kiss your run goodbye. It's the weirdest thing. You're either basically taking no damage, or you're getting sort of cornered, dogpiled, and are completely unable to get out of a situation, and you're just dead. They attack far too quickly, and you attack so slowly and deal so little damage that combat just becomes a boring button masher on the normal difficulty, and there's so little depth or room for counterplay that you're just dying all the faster on veteran, which is supposedly exactly the intended experience. So your weapons and your fury mode are nerfed, finisher moves replace the stun finishers from the first game and have no risk reward factor to them anymore, and health is now regained by just using a consumable or using the fury mode, which barely ticks your health up anymore and takes forever to charge. So the game just basically becomes this whack-a-mole race to knock enemies down into a weakened state to click to kill them. But what could have saved all this mediocre combat is at least good encounter design, but Space Marine's very uneven in this regard too. Some fights will feel like heroic last stands that you barely survived, and the swarm tech that developer Saber perfected in the World War Z game is put to good use here in regards to the Tyranids, but as I've said, they're mostly a visual effect rather than a real threat or an interesting one. These swarms are most noticeably underwhelming when you're holding on a position on a high place and can see the hordes climbing up each other to get to the top. But they do it very slowly and they look very janky as they do, clearly being on some kind of arbitrary timer that has them sort of running in place until they hit the next timer point that triggers them to kind of move up a little bit to get to the top, clearly giving you all this time to shoot them in the back or throw grenades down to neutralize them before they get to you. And if you fail at keeping them down, it's not like they erupt in some cool geyser of aggression and then swarm you. They sort of come 3 to 5 at a time like they're being slowly Pez dispensed. You have to sit still before any grunts will eventually ever damage you, and only the mid-tier big enemies will ever really attack you or push you into some form of counterattack. So many encounters feel so big and chaotic until they just kind of end, lacking a real rhythm or crescendo to the action. Almost like they were all just running water suddenly cut off at the tap instead of a living, breathing horde of individual creatures. The rhythm of combat just feels deceptively empty, or kind of like a formulaic, click attack enough times to trigger the next objective happening. One way, though, in which Saber has definitely improved upon the first game, at least in theory, is adding more boss fights and set pieces. Space Marine had some really tense holdout sequences and turret sections, and even some fun jetpack scenes where you got to smash enemies from the heavens with a jetpack-powered hammer slam or ride on the arm of a mech. It also had 2 middling boss fights, one which seemed rather impossible but then glitched me ahead to the last stage after I died, cheating me past the hard part and letting me complete it easily. Then the last boss was just a bunch of really tough waves that required a lot of kiting, and then you finish the boss off with a QuickTime event to end the game. Interestingly, Saber eradicates most of the horde-based set pieces that actually worked well in the first game, having no turret sections and only 1 or 2 jetpack scenes, and opts to focus in on bosses, which were the last game's probably least impressive feature. I don't think I've ever played a game with bosses less tuned for the ability suite of the player than Space Marine 2. The first sign that these hadn't been tested properly was the Lictor fight. The Lictors are just basically big, heavy-duty Tyranids that can go invisible for a while and pop up to surprise attack you. But unlike, say, the invisible enemies in the Evil Within, where you could see them bump into stuff or walk through liquid to get an idea of where they were, the Lictor can jump all over the place and has no real way to be tracked, no discernible pattern or means of counterplay, so you just take tons of damage or you don't, depending on how lucky you were with putting your head on a swivel and seeing it at exactly the moment it becomes visible again. This fight's really no better in co-op play either, it's just a game of chance. Worse yet, the only boss that I was looking forward to fighting is kept for the co-op missions, so you don't even get the satisfaction of killing it in the campaign, and it's a miserable fight even in co-op. And inexplicably, this mission comes in at the second of 8 co-op missions, despite being at least 2/3 of the way into the main game, so you basically get what is one of the climactic fights promised by the campaign right at the beginning of the co-op campaign, and there's very little at the end of that co-op campaign that compares in, scope or build-up. So I don't know what that's about. So the fight itself is fairly simple, except that once you've done enough damage, the boss will then trigger a huge damaging wave that emanates over and over again across almost the entire arena. And if you happen to trigger this at a bad place on the map, you're just going to have to eat the constant waves of damage and hope you don't die. So being on almost the dead opposite end of the whole arena is about the only way to stay undamaged by this huge wave. This fight and the last boss fight do this same obnoxious, unblockable AoE attack that you just have to eat and hope that you can outlast through sheer attrition. Both fights are just heinous designs, and I cannot believe they made it into the final product. But I guess it makes some sense that the reason the combat's been so simplified into button mashing, because it's intending for you to rely on the critical mass of class abilities and sheer firepower of multiple players. And while I get this design in theory, it really makes the game feel overly indebted to its most enticing but most under-realized aspect, its multiplayer. The PvP is deathly boilerplate, as the clunky movement and generic level design just leads to a lot of random feel-bad deaths as you're unwittingly caught out in the open a lot, and that's if you're not just skulking around the edges hoping no one sees your hulking frame. There are 8 distinct co-op missions, as I said, but these are really where my interest began to wane. Most are very straightforward and with less enemy density than the main campaign, although one boss fight in particular stands out because it requires you to pay attention to the symbols up on the wall, and you need to activate matching symbols on the ground level while dealing with tons of enemies attacking you at once. But it all feels like window dressing to me, and it's just not engaging enough to care about long term past, one playthrough each. But as for what is a little bit more long-lasting and worthy of your time and consideration, that brings me to the spoiler side of things, and that is the most fun part of Space Marine 2, which is its improved, if not highly derivative, story. Okay, so let's see who the new players are and where the story has picked up from. Now please note that I'm going to spoil both Space Marine games fully here, so skip ahead if you're just wanting to hear my final verdict. Okay, so Space Marine's plot was basically Captain Titus and his fellow Ultramarines stopping an orc invasion of the war materials planet of Graia. Titus found out from the Inquisitor Drogon that they can turn the tide of battle if they use a giant mech, but one which does need a power source first. Titus retrieves said power source, but is unwittingly exposed to its dark energies and unwittingly opens a portal to the realms of chaos. So their leader Nemeroth comes through, revealing that he had been controlling Drogon this whole time. Titus manages to secure the mech and eventually drives back Nemeroth, but not before becoming exposed to warp energy again from the power source, which is said to corrupt anything that it touches. Titus seems to be immune to its effects though, which according to Titus's by-the-book associate Leandros, has no precedent in their scriptures. Leandros ends up selling out Titus to the Inquisition despite Titus's resilient sense of duty and his stopping of the invasion. And this leaves the first game on a cliffhanger of how Titus could survive the warp energy at all and what's going to happen to him now that he's been falsely accused of basically being compromised, of being a heretic. Unfortunately, Space Marine 2 really kind of squanders this twist and this setup because it just gives us a tutorial mission of what happened to Titus, and then we're back to things as normal. You see, Titus has been stripped of his position and put into the Death Watch, a kind of suicide squad for heretics to make themselves useful to the Imperium, while they're, kind of in timeout. Things go badly, and Titus is nearly killed in action, but is revived as a Primaris Ultramarine, Games Workshop's new faction that's full of power creep, much to fans' dismay, as they are now basically supplanting the classic Ultramarines as the toughest mofos in town. So, what accounts for Space Marine 2's main points of narrative intrigue are speaking with our Ginger Avenger homie at home base, and earning the trust of our comrades Gadriel and Chiron, I think is how it's pronounced.
I don't know.
Gadriel is a straight-laced dude that's a bit in line with Leandros, a rule follower who doesn't think that Titus should be reinstated at all if he's compromised, especially since Titus keeps making these unilateral decisions in the field that just keep luckily working out. Like when Titus forces himself into classified archives to find out that the Adeptus Mechanicus guys have actually been working on a secret project with the very chaos power source that got Titus into this mess in the first place, despite saying that they destroyed it years earlier. Gadriel almost kills Titus himself when an oracle says that Titus is a traitor, but his candor is interrupted when Chiron shoots the oracle and reveals him to be a chaos agent in disguise named Emura. This is a really cool moment because it gives credence to Titus's sense of judgment and his unwavering loyalty to the Imperium, but it also confirms that, sometimes thinking outside of the box is the only way to survive against enemies who aren't playing by anybody's rules. Titus, Charon, and Gadriel end up becoming this cool gradient of how one should perform their duty and what the limitations of each approach are. You've got the uptight rules follower in Gadriel, the somewhat unpredictable Charon, and the perfect synthesis of dutiful obedience and intuitive risk-taking in Titus. Titus is basically like grimdark Superman. He's unwavering in his commitment to his oath, and he's never disrespecting his superiors, even if he's a bit creative in how he tries to appeal to the spirit of their commands instead of the letter. But anyways, back to the plot. While we get some cool set pieces and boss fights with Emura and all of his buddies by the end, we get no real update on why Titus was ever immune to the warp energy in the first place, and I couldn't tell you why Emura is even here. He's just kind of in the way, and then out of nowhere, an ally named Lord Calgar who comes in like grimdark Nick Fury and just kind of plants himself like, hey, I'm leading you guys, we're about to take the fight to the baddies. We're kind of like, who are you again? And then he gets captured, and then all of a sudden he's very important, and we gotta go rescue him from the villain that we also don't really know why he's here. It's just weird. The storytelling just feels kind of rushed and like we didn't properly set up all the players before they, got to do their thing. I mean, it's not super important, but it's just strange. Titus ends up defeating the forces of chaos and saving Calgar in this really cool dreamlike set piece that just really surpasses anything the series has done so far. And then we get a really cool twist at the end where it's revealed that our parole officer of sorts named Quintus is actually Leandros, who's been promoted as basically the watchdog to, make sure the heretics or possible heretics aren't getting out of line. Calgar then enlists Titus to help him go off to do stuff in the presumable Space Marine 3, which is actually in the works already. And we get a brief glimpse of what that might entail in the new secret level episode on Amazon, although it's really just an action set piece where Titus is seen wearing the laurels that he's earned by saving the world yet again. Overall, it's a pretty satisfying ending. We are a mostly uncomplicated group of do-gooders doing the hard part of putting down uncomplicatedly evil bad guys because, it's the right thing to do, and we get to do it in a cool way. In one of the later levels, there's this really great set piece where we have to make a stand atop a hill and we hold our banner high as we're just encroached on by endless hordes of enemies and just praying that we can get out if you're against all odds. It's that epic, heroic adventure that just makes you feel good to imagine being a part of. It makes you aspire to greatness, and that's what good, epic, heroic stories do. And that said, upon further inspection, though, at its core, the story is really just a remix of the first game's tropes. The story centers around the power source yet again. There's an unexpected betrayal that means the forces of chaos become the main antagonists by the end of the game instead of the more animalistic creatures that we've been fighting. And by the end, the slimy Leandros is still looking over our shoulder, and we get no update on what makes Titus immune to warp energy, what this unprecedented ability could even mean for him, why it was brought up in the first place. We also don't get to see Titus in the doghouse of the Death Watch for anything other than, 20 minutes either. Any chance for new experiences within the pantheon of Warhammer lore is stymied, and we're just back to ultramarining around with no real other emotional or mechanical considerations, more so than we had in the first game. Unfortunately, despite all the sweeping epic music and set pieces and, generally better writing, or at least bigger feeling writing, Space Marine 2 just has middle chapter written all over it, and yet I couldn't even tell you what conclusion this series is angling towards. Its story repeats so many of the same beats as its predecessor and does very little with the promise of its cliffhanger ending, feeling more like a remake to reinsert the franchise into the public consciousness after 13 years of dormancy. Its combat is shallow and repetitive, and feels too balanced around co-op play to account for each player's lack of dominating field presence and counterplay options. It's never bad, and sometimes it's pretty good, but it's never great either, and it gets less and less good the more I played. Now, I love what the team at Saber has done to make this sequel feel big and beautiful, and the writing, voice acting, and music are sensational. The story is dumb, campy fun, but I really wanted to see the core gameplay loop improved upon, even if it was just basically ported into a better looking, better feeling version of itself. Not gutted into a shell of its former self and full of input lag and weak, indistinct weapons. I'm glad the game is done well enough to make Space Marine 3 a very real possibility, but unlike the first game, I've no real reason to return to this one outside of getting that rush as the epic orchestral music spurs me on and makes me feel like a hero while explosions and great military operations take place in the distance. For all its technical improvements, it's just not nearly as special an experience to play as it is to watch and to look at, from its gnarly cutscenes to all the best action tending to happen far off in the distance as giant mechs and monsters duke it out. Why am I not playing the game that's going on in the background oftentimes instead of the worst version of a game that came out in 2011? I don't know, man.
I don't know.
The world may never know.
The world may never know.
Before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Hey Aksho, M, Bibby F. and Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review and James Wyatt. Now, if you'd like to keep what few lights I have on, you should join these folks at patreon.com/Midnight Medium, or become a YouTube channel member, or buy me a coffee and donate at PayPal. Also, check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no extra cost to you. And if you aren't tired of me yet, check me out as I join Deadforge and Robert Yap in the Quad Damage podcast, where we talk first-person shooters with developers and content creators alike. God bless you, everyone, and I'll see you soon.